All right, let's talk about some specifics then, and let's talk about some of the things that we focus on at Liverpool. I'll also provide a little bit of information about the organisational structure because, again, Jens yesterday talked a lot about what's the ideal staffing base. I'm not saying that at Liverpool we've got the staffing base right, but it will give you some examples of the people who are involved in the club. So this is what I call the sports science, sports medicine team at Liverpool. The first thing that you can say is that's an incredibly large amount of people. So it's around 25 staff, and at Liverpool, at the first team training base, we've got 25 players. So effectively, it's like one staff member per player. Let's have a look at some of the areas that we're trying to cover. Okay, this square, like the technical and tactical square, probably is similar all around the world at most clubs. So there's a manager, an assistant manager, first team coach, and a goalkeeping coach. This could be a little bit different. So here's the sports medicine setup, a head of sports science and sports medicine who oversees the whole of the strategy, plus a specific team doctor, 5 physiotherapists, 2 masseurs. Performance analysis. We've got a head of performance analysis. We've got a full-time analyst, and they're supported by 2 students who are recruited through the university. Fitness and conditioning. Head guide Darren Burgess from Australia, who works with a specialist rehab strength and conditioner, who really is the buffer between the injured players and return to the first team. This is interesting though, and this is something that I think will increasingly happen in the UK, is probably already happening in places like Australia in Aussie rules. That the sports scientists are not the same people as the conditioners. That they're a distinct group of individuals. And so from the sports science front, we've got a full-time sports scientist, we've got a PhD student who works in the team, we've got a consultant, who's me, who works 2 days a week, and a nutritionist who works 1 day a week. So that's an incredibly complicated organisation of people to support the 25 players. That's a big, big staffing base. There's probably 2 things that all those people are really interested in. They're clearly interested in conditioning, because if we can affect the training response, then clearly, hopefully, we're going to make people better. And that includes both the on-field conditioning and the off-field conditioning, which is the gym-based work, but also injury prevention, which is becoming increasingly big, not only in the UK, but I know around the world in football. There's a whole strategy for monitoring as well, because as you'll see, hopefully, in the next couple of slides' time, it's important to understand what's going on in the training and the match performance. And so the monitoring strategies are all about trying to understand the game and then understand individual responses to training. Just for the sake of time, really, I'm going to focus on this area here. The match performance insights that we get at Liverpool are produced by a company called ProZone, which is an 8-camera tracking system I'm sure most of you will be familiar with. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about ProZone, or in some cases the data that ProZone produces, just because I think other people will probably cover that type of information in the conference. But what you can see is that just from a single game here, and this was a game where fortunately Liverpool were quite successful, we can get an incredible amount of information on not just the players who are playing for Liverpool, but also the opposition. So things like the total distance in meters per minute, so equalised around time, the high-speed distance, the recovery times. We can get that as team averages compared to the opposition, and then also around the different positions. So we can understand pretty well what's going on in the game. A tremendous resource in a very fast turnaround following a match. So we would get that information around 24 hours post-game. Might talk a little bit more around training though, because I do think that this is an area that is incredibly important to consider, but is fraught with methodological difficulties of getting the appropriate information. Again, useful to give some context about why it's important. Most people, when they're talking about training, think about these things. So they think about the external training load. So that's the quality and the quantity. So how long, how hard, and also the organisation. How am I going to deliver that work? And there is a belief that if you get that right, that the training outcomes are positive. But actually, this slide shows that the real thing that you should be interested in the individual characteristics that modify that external training load, because not everybody will be able to deal with the same training stress. So even though this stays the same for everyone, it's this internal training load that's determined by an individual response to the external work that's crucial. And so all the monitoring strategies that you implement at a club are really about trying to understand an individual response to a training pattern. So at Liverpool, we adopt a multi-method approach. Clearly, we look at some of the external training load factors. So we record time, we look at the specifics of the organisation of what coaches are doing, small-sided games, specific fitness sessions, etc., etc. But we also note the types of activities that people are doing, because those things are important. But internally, we record heart rate from every session. Every player has his own GPS. We have some subjective measurements, both in terms of a response to training, so an RPE around the internal training load for each day, but also subjectives when they first arrive at clubs in the morning to give us some information about how they're feeling. On occasion, we'll use some biochemical methods such as CK to look at responses around muscle damage. And we're also increasingly starting to look at performance measurements because we believe that actually getting something from the neuromuscular system might give us some information about how responsive someone is to a training load. So that's an incredibly, again, sophisticated network of measurements, and now you can start to see some of the reasons around why that team's so big. It probably takes someone around 2 hours to just handle all of that information after each training session, which is an incredibly time-consuming process if you're working as an individual. That's why you need a team of people. I just thought I'd just show you a little bit of information, really, just to emphasize why it's important to use these procedures to understand the training work. Here, I think, is a really good example of how individuals respond differently to the same drill. Okay. So these are guys doing the same training session. You can see everyone has been out for 64 minutes. But when we start to look at these parameters that are coming from both GPS and heart rate, we can see that not everyone's doing the same work. The standard deviations here, in some cases, are quite large. Okay? And so when they're large, what that's telling us is the way the coach is structuring the drill is not letting everyone respond in the same way or work in the same way. And so having the information on each individual is important, and that's why crucially, we need to understand the internal training load rather than just the organisation. Here's an example of why the multi-method approach is important. Here's a traditional heart rate analysis for a training session. 2 players, neither of them working particularly hard in this training session. But then when we look at some of the GPS information down here around impacts and body loads, we start to see actually that training session could be quite stressful. And so whereas cardiovascularly it may not have been very taxing, on the muscular system it could have had a very different effect. And so it was really interesting to hear Jos speak yesterday about the concept of evaluating numerous systems rather than any one physiological system. I think that's quite important. Okay, just to finish then in my last 2 or 3 minutes, I just want to talk about some of the practical issues. And I pulled out this slide because, you know, taking someone's height shouldn't be that difficult, shouldn't it? But I'm not sure if there's any anthropometrists who are out there who are giving me many scores for actually assessing that appropriately. And so it's okay being able to measure things in the applied world, but you need to be able to understand the information and use it correctly. And so I think as scientists, you also need to be aware of some of the pitfalls you might fall into. So a lot of what I do at Liverpool is about improving process. And so while Darren, the head strength and conditioner, is out working with the players, I'm often sitting behind the scenes with the PhD students, just carrying out mini projects. about the consistency and the accuracy of some of the procedures that we use to implement training. So here's just 3 things that we've looked at this year specifically. The recovery strategy post-game, the use of CK, and also the subjectives. And really by doing these mini projects, we're able then to kind of understand the quality of information that we're getting and if what we're doing is any use. Because for me, the one thing that people don't think about a lot in these situations is the players. So we need to have strategies which are player-friendly, which are understood by the players, which are not onerous on the players, because these guys are dealing with a lot of pressure. And so I think it's important for us to actually select the best procedures for them, and that may be actually a different procedure for each player. And so understanding what works and what doesn't, what's accurate and what isn't, enables us to streamline our approach. We've talked a lot about work rate and performance, and I said I didn't want to give a lot of detail about this, but I think this is like a really, really important concept and something that a lot of coaches don't really understand, and that is actually evaluating the noise around the measurement. So what we're talking about now is trying to determine if a change in a value is actually a meaningful change as opposed to against a background of random variation. This is a paper that was lead authored by Warren Gregson from John Moores, who's in the audience, and we were lucky enough to get a huge sample of players' work rate from Prozone, because one thing that hasn't been done a lot in the literature is actually look at repeated measurements of the same player over time. So effectively what we've got here is a coefficient of variation, which in simple terms is an evaluation of the variability over a whole season for a player's work rate, but also over a short-term period, which I think was about 6 or 7 weeks, because theoretically it's perfectly possible that someone's fitness could change over a season, and that could be a co-founding factor. Now, most of you will know that if you work in a laboratory, you'll really want a coefficient of variation of under 10% to be certain that you've got an accurate measurement. But the reality is you make that coefficient even smaller and you're more certain. Will Hopkins would say that for a 100-meter sprinter, we're really talking around the 1% coefficient of variation that's meaningful. But just look at the coefficients of variation of some of these parameters that coaches will routinely use to determine a player's performance. 30% for the total sprint number. Goes up a little bit if you use it over short term. 31% total high-speed running when the team are in possession. 30% for total sprint distance. So it's perfectly possible that there's a whole range of coaches out there who are looking at increases in sprint number, talking about them as being significant as a consequence of an intervention or something like that, when actually it's just within the noise of the system. And so for me, if you don't understand the information that you have and its ability to detect a meaningful change, then you could be actually making that subjective process of making a decision about what you train as bad as the coach. So the first thing you should always do is be looking at the noise around your measurements. Thought it's also quite useful just to show you some difficulties of obtaining data. And you know, I think we've done a lot of good things at Liverpool this year, but I'm not too scared to stand up and say that at times we get things wrong. This, I think, is an interesting slide. Okay, so this is us just trying to obtain RPE ratings as players come off the training pitch. It's not difficult to get an RPE, is it, as someone walks past you? This is data over around a 3-month period. So over that 3-month period, there was a total possible 1,135 RPE measurements that we could have collected from players. So that's 25 players per day over a large number of days. We actually collected 925 of them. So somehow, nearly 20% of the data that we were going to collect from players just walking off the pitch, we missed. Now, whether that was players trying to escape us by hiding in the corner until we'd gone away, whether that was just the inefficiencies of our system, I'm not quite sure. But now I understand that actually we need to do something about that process.